If you like these videos, please check out my full course at www.lsat.totaltestprep.net with tons of clearly explained actual LSAT questions written by someone who's mastered test and helped others master it, and an evaluation period where you only pay if you want to continue.
Okay, so let's take a look at the narrow context in the passage, how to understand that. Well, we essentially, in order to do that, we have to know what the building blocks of a passage are, because that's the narrow context. The narrow context is all the pieces or blocks of a passage that come together to make the overall point or the overall context. Now, in order to understand the passage as a whole, you have to have a good understanding of these elements that make it up, of these building blocks. So, what is a building block and what is its nature? And what are important types of building blocks? So that's what we're going to cover in this video. So, in terms of basic information, once again, you can think of a passage that it's essentially a complex argument that's made out of connected sub-arguments and collections of related statements. So a sub-argument just means that it's an argument as well, but it fits together with other arguments in order to make a bigger argument. Well, as I mentioned before, this is in another video, this is what we've been sort of taught, the way we've been taught to write essays, where we have a basic thesis and then the essay expands on that, fleshes it out with separate arguments that come together to support it. And a collection of related statements is usually statements that aren't organized as an argument, but simply provide context or clarification. Okay, now these arguments, these sub-arguments, can be any of the fundamental types that we've encountered, and they can be connected in various ways. Now, in terms of the fundamental types, essentially you can have arguments that characterize something, that explain something, that provide that have a consequence or prediction, etc. There's going to be a lot of critical or challenging or rejection type arguments as well. We'll get to that in a second. Now, in terms of being connected in various ways, this is the ways in which these sub-arguments fit together to make the overall argument. So the premises in an argument or in one argument may be the conclusion in another, or a conclusion in one may challenge the conclusion in another argument, etc. And in terms of having the premises in, so the first part of that line, the premises in one argument may be a conclusion in another, that's what that's essentially saying, is that the premises themselves that come together to make a sub-argument may have premises for them. And essentially, this is what I was talking about in terms of the standard way we've been taught to write essays. Is we provide a sort of framing argument in the introductory paragraph. That's our thesis that explains why we believe what we believe and why we believe it, and then the rest of the paragraphs we're usually taught to expand on each of the points that support our overall thesis. So that would be an example of that. Now, it's generally not that straightforward in these passages, but you will have aspects of that in terms of having, as I say here, the premises in one argument are going to be a conclusion in another. Although it's going to be, as I mentioned here, the aspect of challenge is going to be very important as well. So in terms of the fundamental types and their connections, you're going to find the standard fundamental types, and there's going to be various types of connections. And to that end, the most helpful thing is to look for these premise and conclusion relationships. So look for the words and look for the types of relationships that we've covered in the other videos in order to identify that you're working with a sub-argument and then figure out how it's connecting to others. Now, this is all obviously things we're going to go in a lot more detail, and we're going to break down actual examples as you move forward. Once again, very roughly speaking, the paragraphs in a passage would be arguments, and the main point of a paragraph is the conclusion of that argument. Now, it's always not always going to be like that, but it happens with enough frequency to pay attention to. So when you look at a passage, you can break it down in terms of the paragraphs and see how do the paragraphs connect, and what is the main point of a paragraph that's usually going to be, or rather that's the main point of that sub-argument, which that paragraph is. Now, as I mentioned before, you're also going to have complex paragraphs, more complex paragraphs, where there's going to be more than one argument involved, and they may be connected in various ways. Additionally, the collections of statements I mentioned introduce or clarify something that is important to the overall discussion. So they're not presented in a argument type structure of support and what is being supported, but they clarify and they provide context. And what you want to understand is that generally these collections of statements, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a second, but they're generally something which the rest of the passage responds to. So they provide some sort of frame or a frame of reference for the author as they move forward to expand on, to support, to respond to challenge, etc. We'll go over that in a lot more detail in a second. But this is, like I said, the other type of building block, sub-argument collection of statement. And as I mentioned, roughly speaking, these paragraphs may contain statements that aren't part of a sub-argument, what we said before, just an actual argument, but they'll act as a reference point for that sub-argument. So fundamentally, this is what you're looking for in the narrow context. Arguments, collections of statements that provide clarification and context and a frame of reference. And as I said, what's going to be important for these arguments, they can be any of the fundamental types, and you'll have to pay attention to how they're connected, and that's something that we'll go in a lot more detail in the next video for this for the narrow and the broad contexts. And then, of course, there's the collections of statements. Now, there is an important building block, which is a perspective. This is something that appears in a large number of passages, and which is something that is very important to be aware of. A perspective is a point of view or an opinion that some group or individual holds. And like I said, you'll find this in a lot of, well, you'll find it generally speaking about 60%, 50 to 60% of the passages are organized around this. And so how do you identify them? Well, some examples would be where, as I say here, most music critics believe rock and roll is not as sophisticated as Baroque music. So there, the music critics are the group or the individual, and their belief about rock and roll compared to Baroque music is their view or opinion. And that would be a perspective. That is something that you definitely want to immediately be able to identify because it's going to be important. It's, once again, something we're going to cover in a lot more detail moving forward with actual examples. Another example would be the biologist Jane Smith contends that bacteria can multiply at much faster rates than previously thought. This would be an individual. We're given an individual and we're given what they think. And this is an example of what I mean by perspective. And this is very important, and I'll explain in a second. You'll see why it's important to be able to identify these. But you definitely want to be able to identify and recognize that a lot of these passages are going to have these important building blocks, which are perspectives. Now, the perspectives are going to be given sometimes with supporting info, in which case there'll be an argument, and sometimes without, in which case there'll be a good example of what I mean by as a collection of statements, a reference point, because then the rest of the passage is in some way going to respond to these perspectives, either critically or clarify them or provide some sort of additional information. So they can be arguments, but not necessarily. A passage itself, likewise, may have one or multiple perspectives. That's the other thing to keep in mind. You're going to have a range. You can have just one perspective, or you can have more than one perspective. And then the way they're going to be related is something, once again, that we'll get to in a second. So perspectives are important because they frame the way in which the discussion is explored. The sub-arguments respond to those perspectives in some way. This is what I was talking about in terms of why they are an important organizing principle, why they're important to be able to identify. Now, I did mention that you can have one or multiple perspectives. If there's only one perspective, then the author is generally going to spend the rest of the passage responding to it. And generally, the author is going to be critical to that perspective, but they may be sympathetic or neutral. However, commonly there's going to be multiple perspectives. And those perspectives can be, and generally are, going to be in conflict with one another, where one challenges the other. They'll bring up a perspective, and then they'll have another perspective that challenges it. A common variation is, as I just said, a perspective is going to be introduced by the author, and then it'll be immediately followed by another, or not necessarily immediately, but it'll be followed by another which challenges it. Likewise, you could have multiple possible ways of multiple perspectives challenging and supporting one another. So it's not necessarily just the author bringing up a perspective and then bringing up one other challenges it. Could be done in different ways where there are several different perspectives that are introduced and then other perspectives challenge those, etc. Now, the perspectives may not necessarily be in conflict. So that's one possibility, that the author introduces a bunch of conflicting or contending perspectives, but not necessarily. A common variation where they're not in conflict is where the author compares and contrasts several different perspectives, and so may or may not challenge them. This just brings them up and points out the ways in which they're similar, they're different, they're overlap, etc. Now, in addition to being, excuse me, in addition to having these arguments where the perspective is an important organizing principle, the passage may not actually explicitly state the perspectives. It may not actually introduce any group or individual in their point of view, and in this case, commonly the passage is going to be structured around an author's thesis, which doesn't respond to other points of view, which doesn't introduce other points of view. It's just the author introducing something and giving us sort of their development or their exploration of that. And generally, the author doesn't actually explicitly state that they're expressing their point of view. So it's not as if the author says, I, the author, believe this thing, and then you can kind of identify it as perspective, or it's not phrased in the way other perspectives might be introduced in passages that deal with perspectives. It'll simply be the author just exploring something. Generally, the beginning of the passage is going to introduce the thesis, and the rest of the passage will develop it. Usually, the first paragraph provides context about a particular topic, and then the main point or the author's thesis, once again, not necessarily stated as the author's perspective the way the others are. Although sometimes you actually will have the author's thesis in the second paragraph. After that, the remaining paragraphs will then further explore the author's perspective, their thesis. They'll introduce, clarify, define key concepts. They'll show how they provide support. They'll provide examples or evidence for something. They'll deal with counterarguments, etc. It's just they will be presenting what the author thinks about something in the standard way. And the topic will generally have a certain level of complexity with respect to what the author is talking about. So it might be unexpected consequences. There might be some sort of contrast between states that develop, or contradictory or conflicting aspects to something, or comparisons between different things. They like to do that. They like to introduce this sort of compare and contrast element. If you notice the things I mentioned here, kind of contrasting between states as they develop, contradictory aspects, comparison. They like to do that. That's a sort of standard way of making something more complex, is by showing that it's got multiple moving parts that in some way may not necessarily easily connect. So that's one of the common ways in which they make these authors, or rather these passages that don't involve comparisons of perspectives, a little bit more complex. Okay. Now, in the passage, basically what's going on is that you've got these sub-arguments and collections of statements. You want to look for conclusion indicator and premise indicator words. So that lets you know that you're dealing with support. You want to look for words like, for example, and synonyms for that. You want to look for opposition indicator words like but, however, on the other hand, yet, etc., since these are often used for criticism. And this is going to essentially be, as you're reading this in the passage, this is going to be how you're going to more easily identify when you're working within the narrow context of what the sub-arguments are and what exactly they're saying in the collections of statements as well. When you're dealing with perspectives, you want to look for statements which establish individuals or groups of individuals and what they think concerning a particular topic. So any mention of an individual or group should be carefully read. And remember that perspectives usually appear in the first and beginning of the second paragraph. If there's only one or two perspectives, there are some passages that will just keep introducing perspectives on a topic just to compare or contrast them across, say, 4 or 5 paragraphs. But generally, it's within the first couple of paragraphs. So this is when you have perspectives. If you don't have perspectives, so the passage is without perspectives, you want to look for statements where the author is making an evaluation, an assessment, a categorization, definition, identification, when they are when they're reasoning over something, usually in the first paragraph. And you also want to look for statements that introduce some sort of duality or tension. And this is what I was talking about before about compare and contrast, which is what they like to do. So counter expectations of something, contrasting different things. As I said before, words such as but or however, on the other hand, yet, etc. If there's no obvious perspective in the first paragraph, then in the second one, look for a claim that is a more in-depth exploration of something from the first paragraph. So if it's not obvious what the author is talking about in the first paragraph, if it seems like they're just, sort of touching up on a lot of things across all across the board, see how it is that the second paragraph, see what it is that it connects to from the first, and how it maybe more broadly develops it or explores it in a little bit more detail. Okay, so to give a quick summary, a passage is essentially a complex argument made out of connected subarguments and collections of related statements. And those are the building blocks. And another important building block, or rather an important building block, is the perspective. Remember, the perspective could simply be just a statement or related statements, but it could also be an argument. It could also have support for it. And keep in mind also that a passage may not explicitly state perspectives. You may have one where it's just the author developing or exploring a theme.